Hello again, historians, how are you? You've come back for Mrs Hopwell's second history waffle. Thank you very much. It's very good to see you. Hope you're all well. Thank you very much for your responses on this week's challenge about a Stuart Queen and marmalade. Well done to those of you who have found out things about that. Yes, the Stuart Queen in question is a lady called Mary Queen of Scots, very important lady. And marmalade, actually, as some of you have discovered, wasn't actually the marmalade that we know and love. It's not this stuff. Ooh, my kitchen's very messy. It's not that stuff. It's actually, in the 16th century, it's made out of quince, which is a type of pear. The Portuguese for quince is marmelo, and quince pear was sort of heated with butter and honey, and it was made into a paste. And we might have something similar this day called quince cheese, which is quite nice at Christmas. And yes, in 1524, Henry VIII was given a big box of marmalade as a present, and apparently Anne Boleyn quite liked it as well. So very interesting marmalade facts. Well done. So today we are going to be learning about Mary, Queen of Scots, and why marmalade was so important and why she was so important, because she was. But to start with, we're going to go back to the birth of a king who wasn't a king when he was born, but he was a prince, and he was called Henry. He was Henry Tudor. He was born in 1491. He had an older brother called Arthur, who was going to be the King of England. But Arthur, who was Prince of Wales, went to live in Wales with his wife, who was a lady called Catherine of Aragon, and Arthur died. Arthur died of something probably, historians think, was malaria or sweating sickness. Arthur out of the way meant that Henry could become king when his dad died. Henry's dad was called Henry. It gets very complicated. But when Henry VIII's dad died in 1509, Henry VIII became Henry VIII, if that makes sense. Next week, I'm going to be talking all about why the Tudors came onto the throne in the first place and why various things happened in 1603. Anyway, Henry VIII on the throne, bit of a controversial king. He had 6 wives. The first 3 wives were women who, for one reason or another, ended up not surviving. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who was his brother's wife, she managed to give Henry 6 children. But the precarious nature of the times meant that only one of them survived, and that was a daughter called Mary. Catherine of Aragon was a Catholic queen. She was from Spain. She was a Spanish princess, so she raised Mary, her daughter, as a Catholic. Because Henry wanted the Tudor dynasty, his family dynasty, to last. It was very new. It had only been around since the beginning of reign of his dad. He wanted to make sure that the Tudor dynasty had sons who could inherit the throne, because we followed a system called primogeniture. I think that's how you pronounce it. This is how it's written. And that meant that the firstborn son only would inherit the throne. So, big problems, because Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine, only had Mary, who was surviving. So he started casting his eyes around and he saw quite fancied Anne Boleyn. So he managed to get Anne Boleyn together after a long time. He divorced Catherine, married Anne, and Anne had a baby, but that was also a girl, Elizabeth I, as she became known. Problems. Poor Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn died because she was unable to give Henry what he wanted. And then he was casting his eyes around again and he saw Jane Seymour. Fancied Jane Seymour, got Jane Seymour married, got Jane Seymour pregnant. She produced a boy called Edward. Hurrah! Not Henry, but Edward. So, that's the English situation. Henry VIII is on the throne being bossy and killing people and being generally tyrannical. He's got 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth and Edward. Right, going north, Scotland. So, on the throne of Scotland were the Stuart kings. Now, the Stuart kings were generally okay at reproducing heirs. They managed to get that down to a fairly good T. There were lots of Jameses that I'm going to tell you about. So they managed to live to adulthood, get married, have babies, which is good, but they generally sort of ended their kingships quite badly. James I, I think, was poisoned or stabbed. James II was, as I understand it, inspecting a cannon, and he was either near it or he was actually sticking his head down inside the cannon and it exploded and he died. James III was sitting, I believe, on a toilet when his castle that he was in was under siege, and a lucky archer had fired an arrow up the toilet chute and it went into his bottom and killed him. James IV died at Flodden Field in 1513, and James V, who we're going to talk about now, turned his head to the wall and sighed and died. He turned his head to the wall because he found out that his wife, Mary of Guise, had just given birth to a daughter. Now, being a woman, I find that a little bit offensive, but I'll just explain why. Mary of Guise was a French princess. Her father was Duke of Guise and the Duke of Lorraine, and she had been married in France to a man, and she had given that man, I don't know what his name was, but she'd given him 2 sons, so she was able to have babies. And then her first husband died, and she was sort of back on the market, as it were. So at the time when Jane Seymour died in England in 1537, Henry VIII was quite sad, apparently, although I'm not sure if it was. I think he was just looking for more people to marry and annoy and destroy. But he was looking for another wife who would have children with him. Mary of Guise was proven to be able to have children, so she was an option, but she was already engaged to James V of Scotland. Henry VIII muscled in on the French negotiations and said, why are you sending her up to Scotland? Let her marry me instead, because I'm a much better choice. I'm the King of England, he's just as King of Scotland, it's much better. The French were having none of it. They'd seen how he treated Catherine of Aragon, how he treated Anne Boleyn, and how he treated Jane Seymour. So they said, no, you are not having Mary of Guise, you can shove off. So they ended up setting Mary of Guise on a boat, and she sailed north to Scotland and she married James V. But yes, she gave James V, the first child she gave him was a daughter. So James V was quite sad about this, and he died, which meant that at the age of 9 days old, Mary, Queen of Scots, became the Queen of Scots. If you go to Edinburgh Castle today, you can see the Scottish honours. I think they're in Edinburgh, they might be in Stirling. Anyway, the Scottish honours are the crown jewels of Scotland, and they're amazing because they are the original crown jewels that even Robert the Bruce wore when he got crowned king. The ones in the Tower of London, the English ones, were remade after the Civil War, so they're much younger, but the ones in Scotland are the ancient real deal, and they're amazing. Anyway, so if you go and see the Scottish honours, you can see the crown that was put on the baby Mary's head. So at the age of 9 days old, she becomes queen. Now, as we know, when a monarch is crowned queen at such a young age, it doesn't really work very well because they're too tiny to do anything. They can't make any decisions. They can't, well, certainly Mary couldn't even walk or talk at 9 days old, could she? So she was a queen, but not really a queen. People did the job for her. Henry VIII realised that obviously his chances of marrying a Scottish relation wasn't going to work, but he did have his son Edward now, and he thought, oh, Edward, and then he thought, oh, Mary, fantastic combination. They could both get married, and then we could get Mary down to England, bring her up in the English court, job's a good one, unify the country, England, Scotland, tick, done. So there was something called the Treaty of Greenwich, which happened in 1543. Mary, Queen of Scots, was born in 1542. In the Treaty of Greenwich, Henry VIII said, yes, we're going to have Mary, she's going to come down to England, and we're going to raise her, and everything's going to be tip-top. The Treaty of Greenwich was completely and totally ignored and totally voted against by the Scottish Parliament. They decided they were having none of it. Henry VIII got quite cross. He wanted Mary very much, so he sent his army north and he invaded Scotland and burnt the lowlands to the ground. It's a period of history called the Rough Wooing, and there was a massive battle called the Battle of Pinkie in 1547. Pinkie as in little finger. It's the best named battle I think there has ever been. And the Battle of Pinkie was a resounding success for the English. They completely routed the Scots, and it was a nightmare. So the Scottish people scooped up little little Mary, who was 5 years old by this point. And they hid her to start with in a place called Dunkeld, which is up in the Trossachs, sort of on the River Tay. It's beautiful. They hid her up there to keep her safe. And then the English army kept encroaching and getting nearer and nearer. So they scooped her up and took her to a place called Inchmahome Priory, where they were looked after. And Inchmahome Priory is beautiful. You could go there today as well. It's a sort of a priory on an island. You have to get a boat across, and it's just lovely. Anyway, so she was there, being 5 and feeling a bit ill because she kept being moved around a lot. And so the story goes that because she was suffering from travel sickness and generally feeling a bit blah, that her cooks and her chefs decided to make her some marmalade. Now, it's quite possible, in passing, that a Scot overheard a French chef wandering past with a pot of marmalade, as was then the quince jelly stuff. And the Scot could have said, "What's that in that pot? What's that in that pot?" They might have said. And the French servant might have said, "Mary est malade," as in Mary is ill. And it could have happened. And the Scots could have misunderstood and just thought that the thing in the pot, the dish that was in front of them, was actually called marmalade. It's an interesting story. We don't know if it's true, probably not true, but it's nice. But the important thing is that Mary, Queen of Scots, survived. In the end, the Scots decided that they would form something called the Old Alliance with France and get Mary back across to France where her mum had grown up. So she left the shores of Scotland when she was about 6 from a castle called Dumbarton Castle on the west coast of Scotland, and she sailed down the Irish Sea and she arrived in France, and she was happily there for 14 years, I think. She married the Dauphin of France, who was a man called Francis II. So the Dauphin of France was the heir to the French throne. His dad was Henry II, I think, and Henry II obviously at some point didn't last forever, and Francis II became King of France, which means that Mary herself became Queen of France, which is amazing. A big pastime at the time was jousting. Unfortunately, Francis II was quite keen on jousting, and he went into a jousting competition and he got a splinter of wood in his eye from a lance as it flew through his visor into his eye, and that killed him. So that meant that suddenly Mary, who had been Queen of France for not very long, suddenly was no longer Queen of France. Her mother-in-law was a lady called Catherine Medici, and she didn't like Mary Queen of Scots at all. She made everything very difficult for her. So in the end, Mary Queen of Scots decided to go back north and go back home to Scotland. So she did. She had to write a letter to Queen Elizabeth I to ask her. By this time, Queen Elizabeth I was on the throne in England, and she had to ask her for safe passage through the waters around England, and Elizabeth I didn't give it to her. So it was a bit of a risk, Mary going on a boat to sail up to Scotland in case her boat came into trouble, and then Mary would end up in England and she would be imprisoned, and all sorts of things could have happened. As it was, her boat and then ended up in Leith outside Edinburgh. She arrived early, so nobody knew she was coming, so she was on her own when she got there, and she became Queen of Scotland again. It was quite an interesting time because Scotland by this point was Protestant. Mary was Catholic still, but the Parliament in Scotland decided that if Mary was happy, if she was happy to celebrate her Catholic religion in her own chapel in Holyrood, then and let the rest of the country be Protestant, then that would work. So for a while it worked quite nicely. Mary was liked, and she was beautiful, and she was clever, and she managed to keep the nobles on side, and she worked really hard to make sure that her time as regent, as queen, was working. However, she started looking around for a husband. Now the problem lies in when a woman was married at this time, anything that she had when she became married became the ownership of a husband, which is why Elizabeth I never married, because she knew that if she married a man, then she would effectively pass the throne over to him and he would have control. Mary Queen of Scots wanted a husband, and she was scouting around looking for some people. Elizabeth I offered Mary various of her suitors that she quite liked, Essex, Raleigh, things like that. She sent letters saying, "He's really nice, I think you should get together with him." But Mary Queen of Scots was having none of it. She did not want to be told what to do, and she ended up choosing somebody called Robert Lord Darnley. Now he was related to both Mary and Queen Elizabeth I through his grandma, so it was a little bit like marrying a cousin, which is a bit weird. Anyway, they got married. She was very much in love and besotted with Darnley. However, Darnley then showed his true colours and he wanted control of the Scottish throne, and Mary refused to give it to him. They didn't get on very well at all within weeks of being married. And although Darnley gave Mary a baby, she became pregnant by him. She got so fed up with Darnley that in the end, Darnley was killed. Now, his house, Kirkfields, was blown up one night, and then his body was found in the garden, strangled. And here's a picture showing about that. All suspicions turned to Mary. In fact, even modern day historians think that Mary probably had something to do with it. So after the birth of her son, who became another Prince James, she was sort of effectively told to go away by the Scottish people. They didn't want anything to do with her because she was implicated in this murder of her husband, which was a fairly awful thing to do, really. Also, there was a man called James Hepburn, who was a nobleman in the Scottish court, and he had his eye on Mary. So after the death of Darnley, he kidnapped Mary and took her back to his castle, where he forcibly, some say, got married to her again, and also got her pregnant. At which point everybody in Scotland had had enough of Mary and her ways, and they forced her to abdicate after a battle called the Battle of Carberry Hill. She was taken as a prisoner. Bothwell escaped to Norway and died in Norway. She was taken prisoner onto Loch Leven Castle, which is up in Scotland, and she had to sign over her throne to her son, James VI, who was still a baby at that point. And she was no longer queen. So she scouted around looking for help and support, and one person she thought she could trust and rely on was Elizabeth I. So she wrote to Elizabeth I and said, "Can you help me?" Elizabeth said, "Of course, come to England and I will look after you." And she went to England and she was put under house arrest. And for the rest of her days, she was moved around England in various houses. One near Skipton called Norton Towers is one of the places where she was kept, which is up, you can see it from the road going up to Grassington. She was involved in all sorts of plots, allegedly, against Elizabeth I, which were discovered by her Elizabeth's spymaster, Walsingham. And ultimately, after one particular plot called the Casket Letters and the Babington plot, Mary, Queen of Scots, went too far and she was found guilty of treason. She was trying to get Elizabeth I killed, and she was found guilty of treason and she was executed at Fotheringay Castle. But it's important to know about Mary, Queen of Scots, because she was the mother of James VI. And James VI, of course, became the king after Elizabeth I had died in 1603. So that's a whole new story. So next week, I'm going to be talking to you about something called the Chequers Ring and what that was, and the importance of it, and how it all happened, and what it meant for James VI, or James I, as he became known, to become the King of England and Scotland, and how that all happened. So see what you can find out about the Chequers Ring and what it was, where it is, if they know where it is, and who was responsible for taking it at some point in 1603. It's a very exciting story. And that's that. That's my story for the week. I hope that's okay. Have a go at the quiz. Let me know how you did. Well done to those of you who've done that already. Great job. Good job. And I will see you all again next week. I might not be in the kitchen next week. I might be somewhere else. Who knows? Exciting. Right. Goodbye. Sorry, bubbling. Bye.